few questions for you. Do you believe in luck or chance? Have you ever had those moments where you weren't sure how you got what you got, and it just seemed like pure luck? Do you believe in random chance? Chance is when you think that something can happen to you without you even knowing, or without regard of what you have done. It just seems like a random happening. Now, I'm going to share a little story with you of, I'd say, a lucky chance that I had. So a few years ago, I was in a rush to get somewhere. And I borrowed my parents' car, and I was on a rush, and I got pulled over for speeding too fast. I know, I'm sorry. I got pulled over for speeding too fast, and I gave, my license and registration to the police officer, and he came back, and he said, "I'm looking here. Is so-and-so your father?" And I said, "Well, yes, he is." And he says, "That's cool. He taught me how to use this radar gun." I was like, "Oh, no kidding. No kidding." And he says, "Yeah," and he just goes on saying, "Well, you know what? I'm going to let you off with a warning, because if my dad hears about it, what he's going to do." But he let me off with a warning, and then he tells me, he's like, "Oh, by the way, just make sure you tell your father I say hi." And so I'm like, "Will do." Scurry away, and I was pretty lucky, and honestly, I don't think I can play that card again. So that was my one lucky chance. And so today we're going to be talking about an icon that found herself in a lucky situation. We're going to be talking about Esther. Now, Esther was a young Jewish woman who lived during the reign of King Xerxes. And Esther was part of the first round of Jews that returned to Jerusalem and the Promised Land to resettle after being sent away in exile as slaves. So previously, the Jews had been enslaved and shipped out of their home country for several hundred years, and it was a big deal that they were allowed to return to Jerusalem. But it was still very difficult for the time for the Jews, since they were occupied by the Persian Empire. In the book of Esther, we learn the story of an unlikely hero and the winner of a beauty pageant in which she did not want to compete in. Her Jewish name was Hadassah, and she was renamed Esther, which means star. What is interesting and odd in this book, in the Bible, is that God was not mentioned at all. Even though God never speaks in the book of Esther, it is very clear that God was at work behind the scenes of the events that are described in this story. And so we're going to be diving into Esther, and we're going to start in chapter 2, verse 7 and 8. It reads, "He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as her own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women." So Hadassah was a Jewish young lady, and she became a hero in this lucky story. God was at work behind the scenes, and we figure out why it's so important that Hadassah, now named Esther, became one of the king's wives. Esther did not have a lot going for her. I mean, she was orphaned, and she was being raised by her uncle Mordecai. And it's a cultural habit for the ruler king to take a wife from each of the people he conquered. As Xerxes continued to reign over the Jews, he chose wives from the Jews, and Esther was one that he chose. You may see Esther being chosen as a wife for the king as unfortunate, random event, but God was really working behind the scenes. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus, oh my goodness, into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women. She won grace and favor in his sight, more than all virgins, so that he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great feast for all of his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal gestures. So Esther won favor over the other women, and one whom the king favored more than the others. In fact, the king so highly favored her that she took the place of a woman who had been queen to become the new queen of the Persian Empire. To celebrate her to become queen, Xerxes named here ordered a feast for her. God had elevated this orphaned young Jewish girl in the ranks of queen of the Persian Empire. Then a moment occurred that was critical in the story, and it helps us understand why God placed Esther as a queen in Persia. Haman, one of the king's guards, became so jealous of the Jews that he hatched a plan to turn the king against the Jews and have the Jews exiled and executed by the king. So God was at work again in the story as Mordecai, Esther's uncle, who encouraged Esther to appear before the king to stop Haman planned to kill the Jews. If you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise from the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to a kingdom for such a time as this. For such a time as this. And this is a pivotal moment in Esther's mind because she had to choose for herself whether or not random events that saw her elevated in the position of queen was purely random or was part of God's action through it all. What Mordecai said to Esther is that while she may have thought it was a random chance that she was in her position as queen, and it was instead for a reason that she could stop the execution of her people, that God had placed her in that position. So Esther decided to appear before the king, and was quite bold action on her part. She could have been killed just appearing before the king without being summoned. She would have been killed. Instead of being killed, Esther was rewarded with a favor from the king, which Esther used to expose Haman and stop him from killing the Jews. And through this pretty elaborate trap, to expose the truth of what Haman was planning to do to the Jewish people, Esther spoke up and showed Xerxes what was going on. So the king and Haman went in to feast with the Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss of the king." Then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he? Who has dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. So because of Esther's boldness, the Jewish people were saved from annihilation. Now, what would you characterize the events of the story? Would you call it luck? Would you call this story luck, the events? Or was she just at the right place at the right time? I believe Mordecai suggested to Esther that Esther was there for such a time as this. Some would call the events of the story as providence, meaning that God was orchestrating the events of history. And it is true that God was at work, but he was working quietly and without mention. And instead of luck, I like to think of the events of Esther as serendipity. And it's a funny word. So we'll call this like a Bob Ross happy little accident. While this is interesting way to understand this word, I want to dig it into a little deeper. While God may seem to have been quiet and absent in the story, it was clear that God was at work behind the scenes when Esther was chosen to be part of the harem of wives. When she was elevated as queen, Mordecai encouraged Esther to appear before the king. The king listened to Esther. The Jewish people were saved from destruction. Another fascinating tidbit I was reading in chapter 4 is that, Mordecai encouraged Esther, but they weren't really face to face. She was in, the castle, and he was out by the courtyard. So he was way gone. Even by yelling, they wouldn't be able to hear each other. And so Esther had a servant to go and see Mordecai, and then he be the messenger in between. Now the servant, who is somebody that respected the king, in my opinion, he could have said nothing at all. And yet, he was the one that went back and forth and talked as the messenger. I thought that was a really interesting point, because in that moment, I don't think, the Jewish would have been saved if that guy didn't go back and forth as the messenger. Just a little interesting tidbit. But where are those serendipity moments for you? Or God moments? The story about a God moment in my life. After university, I was eager to do what I was trained to do. I was like, yes, I'm going to, hang out with kids all the time. I'm going to worship God. I'm going to lead a church. It's going to be so exciting. And then I end up at Tim Hortons. I respect those that work in fast food or in restaurants or just generally 8 hours a day with people. That's because specifically fast food, it was a time. And I was really angry with God. I was like, why am I here? Why am I just serving coffee and, getting yelled at because I didn't put enough milk in somebody's coffee? And until a coworker of mine said, Ben, I really love working with you because you really light up the room. You really make my shift so much better. And then I realized, well, hello. Ministry for me doesn't have to be, ministry for everybody doesn't have to be in a specific location. Who we are and what we do, that is ministry. We are, as Christians, a light to those who are in darkness. We shine Jesus' light to those that are in darkness. Our mission, our ministry, is just to simply be Christ-like and to share the good news that is Jesus Christ. So what? After so many years, I go back to Tim Hortons unexpectedly. My mission is just to shine Jesus' light. That's the important part. and as we close, I want to give 3 very clear challenges. One is to ask God to use you. Ask God to put you into situations where you can bring God's glory. Ask God to use you. Jesus mentions in Matthew seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and all things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble in its own. Ask God. Go to God. Seek and how he can use you. 2, keep your spiritual eyes and ears open, looking for ways that God may be at work in the situations you experience. Ask him how he can lead you. In Matthew 13, it talks about the parable of the sower, and the disciples are asking, why are you speaking in parables? And he talks like, well, I have to share this because people may hear and listen to my stories, but they don't really get what the story is about. And then he encourages his disciples, but blessed are you, your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but do not see it, and hear what you hear, but do not hear it. So keep your spiritual eyes and ears open, looking for ways that God may be at work in the situations you experience. And the last point is to be brave and bold. Brave and bold enough to go, brave to speak about God to others. And as you go throughout your day and as you enter new situations, pause and ask God to show you what he wants you to see in those moments. Ask God to help you hear what he wants you to hear. You've heard this many times. But to go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and Holy Spirit. Jesus commands us to go, to preach the gospel. And so as you go about your day tomorrow, and as you touch the threshold of the door, ask God to help you use the time you have in your situation for his glory. As you sit down on your breaks and you're with people, pray to God to help you use the conversation around your table or around where you are, use that conversation to honor him. Think about each encounter as an opportunity for a God moment. So active listening is another key with listening for God moments. When people are talking, actually pay attention to what they are saying. Ask someone how they are doing. If they respond with a negative energy, be encouraging. Ask, pray for them. Another way is that just pray for people, even if they're not asking for it. Now I'm not like, it'd be kind of weird just to be like, Eric, I'm going to pray for you right now, and you just, oh, okay, that's weird. Just in your mind, just pray for the person before you're in conversation with them. You may not be in a situation to save an entire group of people, but you may just be in a situation that God can use in a powerful way. One thing that I got out of the CBAC conference is that reach for the one. You don't need to reach an entire collective group. You don't need to reach to like 10, 15 people. But if you reach for the one, disciple the one, imagine that one growing deeper into faith and then discipling another one. And how big the faith will become as one person disciples one person, and more people come to faith through that. More intentional relationship. See? That's important. Now, of course, big groups, easy to contact, but really digging deep with the one. That's good. So in the spirit of Esther, I want you to listen to Mordecai's words and hear that you might just be in a place that you are in your life for such a time as this.